Welcome to Good Enough with the Trauma Therapist, a podcast dedicated to empowering you to take control of your life, learning valuable strategies for healing and looking at mental health through a trauma-informed lens. Get ready to feel empowered and confident in managing your symptoms. And now, here is your host, licensed clinical social worker, EMDR therapist, and certified clinical trauma professional, Jamie Vollmoeller.
Welcome to Good Enough. I am your host, Jamie Vollmoeller. So excited to talk to you guys today. Today, I wanted to talk about how we learn from our past. Obviously, guys, I classify myself as a trauma therapist, so getting into our past is something that I do a lot for myself and for my clients. But I kind of wanted to talk to you guys about why we do that, why that is so important. And for me, it's about truly learning not just how to survive, because I work with so many people who have been through traumatic life events who feel like, oh, I've learned from that. I don't make those mistakes anymore. But the trauma also caused them to go to coping strategies or solutions that maybe aren't the most helpful or productive that continue to influence their life. So they did learn from their trauma. They learned how to survive and survival responses. But what we really want to work on is remaining alert to the dangers or threats that are out there, but also not losing our humanity, right? And that is something that I see a lot with clients that go through emotional distress or traumatic life events, is that they really struggle to stay in touch with their emotions. It's almost like they're numb to their emotions, because our emotions can be really, really overwhelming. And for a lot of these clients, what will happen is they'll have really, really intense emotions or no emotions at all. So those emotions, bottle up. But part of the reason we want to go into the past or do the work when we experience something traumatic is because there is such a thing as post-traumatic growth, guys. So post-traumatic growth refers to the positive psychological changes that occur as a result of struggling with adversity or trauma and overcoming it. So it's experiencing personal growth through that struggle and seeing their own resilience and having a greater appreciation for the little things in their life, right? Like, we are never going to go through life without stressful things happening. It is so part of the process of just being a human being. But when we learn to embrace the challenge, embrace the adversity, embrace, even no matter how horrible it is, learn how we can grow from whatever we have experienced, whether that's within ourselves, whether that's, outside of ourselves, how can we challenge ourselves and grow? And for me, the worst part about that trauma is that it puts us on high alert. And for those of us who are true, trauma survivors, we make a lot of decisions based on our past and what has worked for our survival. What is going to protect me, right? And those can be some of our worst impulses, guys. And I see this as a trauma kid. And I know for me, when I get really, really triggered, I get angry, right? And that anger kind of blocks out all of my other emotions. The compassionate side of me is gone. It's the anger part of me takes over everything else. And I am just on a path of destruction, right? That impulse that's I'd rather burn this all to the ground than not win right now. When you're in that argument and you're wrong, but you're never going to admit you're wrong because you're too angry to admit you're wrong. That's the impulse I'm talking about, guys. So whether that thing is a relationship, a job, a personal belonging, whatever, we have this impulse sometimes that's if I can't get what I want, if my needs can't be met, then everyone else is going to be miserable. And that for me, I know that comes from a place in childhood where I felt like the only way I could get what I want was to be really loud and demanding and scream and yell. which isn't great for a child, but it's even 10 times worse for an adult. But as adults, we manifest that in other ways. So the thing that I really, really, really want to get through to you guys is working through our past is so, so important, because those trauma responses can become like significant parts of our personality. And I think for a lot of my clients, what's been interesting is exploring, is this pattern, is this impulse really you? Or is this coming from a part of you that feels scared, fearful, intimidated, unsafe? Right? Because I think when we have the same patterns throughout our life, we start to see ourselves as certain types of people. And we might not like those types of people. Like, I've worked with a lot of people who feel very hopeless and angry at themselves and guilty and shameful for the things that they've done in their lives that they did in response to significant traumatic things happening to them. And one of the beautiful things about looking at our past is that we can look at that past and see why we acted in that way, right? We can then learn what we did well, what we did that was strengths-based and resilient and strong, and what we did that maybe wasn't the best response. But without looking at that, right, and really deciphering, was this the best response or not? And I've worked with people too who are like, well, it's not my fault because I had to do this. So, sometimes you just have to do horrible things. And though that is true, when we look at it, right, when we give it the attention that it deserves and we really reflect, it gives our brains the possibility and the opportunity to learn other ways of handling that. So if a similar situation comes up, we don't default to that trauma response that we're not proud of and continue the pattern of repeating these behaviors that don't make us proud of ourselves, right? And one of the beautiful things about the work we do in EMDR is it's truly like, when I say learn from our past, some of the most beautiful things that I remember in my own treatment is just the way I remembered incidents wasn't entirely clear. And going back in and doing EMDR in the processing phase, where you're doing that bilateral stimulation and the tapping, you kind of have like these flashbacks of like what happened. And what's really interesting is you'll see all these other details and things that happen that maybe you didn't register quite as much, probably because they weren't as threatening, right? We tend to register in our brains the things that are going to put us in some sort of unsafe situation, right? So when we look back at those situations in the present, sometimes we can't see the other positive things that happened, like the people that supported us, or how we coped in positive ways, or the other ways we tried before we took actions that we weren't proud of, right? And going back in and looking at my past and being able to see it from that perspective, it kind of opens up your brain to these other memories that maybe that are not as vivid for you right now. But when we go into the processing phase, they become very vivid, and we can realize all these beautiful things about ourselves and truly learn about ourselves. And I think that's the process of therapy for me, is really like learning who I am, like the person that I am at my core, who I want to be, and not the different types of trauma personalities or characteristics that I can have in response to some of the things that have happened to me. One of the biggest statements that I love is like, you are what you do, right? So our actions is what determines who we are as people, not what we say, and our repeated actions, right? That doesn't mean one thing. Like, one action in your life doesn't define who you are. It's the consistency of your actions over time, and doing that work and going into our past and looking at what worked, what didn't, why did I do this? Learning to be compassionate to ourselves is one of the biggest things that we do in learning from our past, because all of my clients are their biggest critics. They are harder than themselves than anyone else. And that's really, really common, guys. And that's because our brains develop this inner critic to keep us safe. That's really the purpose of it, right? When we're constantly criticizing ourselves, it's so that we don't fall into these traps or patterns where we were unsafe or people get upset with us or whatever that issue was in the past. Our brain is trying to help us avoid that. It's unfortunate because a lot of the time in adulthood, your situation might be very, very different. You might have made a very good life for yourself and been in a very positive relationship, and yet you still have all of these negative thoughts about yourself from your past. So when we get back from break, I definitely want to talk about that more and how going into your past can really help you to develop some self-compassion and learn who you are truly. You can follow us on anywhere you stream your podcasts at Good Enough with a Trauma Therapist. Stick around, guys. Thank you for listening to Good Enough with a Trauma Therapist. This is your host, Jamie Vollmoeller. If you live in the states of New York or Missouri, we'd love to work with you. New Yorkers, give us a call at Long Island EMDR at 631-503-1539 or visit our website at liemdr.com. And for those of you living in Missouri, please call Brave Counseling and Psychiatry at 573-825-6441. Visit brave-mo.com. Welcome back to Good Enough, guys. I am your host, Jamie Vollmoeller. So today we've been talking about learning from our past and why it's important. And so two of the top reasons is reflecting on our past helps us gain insight into our own strengths, weaknesses, and how we coped, right? Whether that was healthy or unhealthy. And learning from our past challenges allows us to adapt and grow rather than just have them ingrained. Because especially if you've experienced chronic stress. And trauma, guys, again, can be anything. It can be a chronic medical condition. It can be a toxic relationship. It can be a toxic work environment. It can be, a physically or sexually abusive situation. Chronic stress has many different forms. It can be chronic financial stress and not making ends meet and not having your basic needs met. But what happens when we experience chronic stress is that to survive, our brain defaults to the easiest or the only way that we can cope with that at that time. And without reflecting and going into our past and seeing, was this something that was just a survival mechanism for me at that time? Or is this something that I still need or is still helpful to me today? Makes it very, very, very difficult to know if, what you need to do to grow, right? And when we don't look at our past, we tend to get stagnant. We really don't have any growth. So without learning from our past experience, we're very likely to repeat harmful behaviors or remain trapped in these negative thinking patterns, especially if you experience chronic emotional abuse. So that inner critic that I'm talking about, a lot of my clients had less than perfect parents who, did what parents do. They would, say things to them about not being a good student or not doing enough around the house or how lazy they are as teenagers. But, even in adulthood, they're like, I'm lazy, I'm this, I'm that. And some of them had, those are average parents. Some of them had some pretty tough parenting. And when we have that kind of tough parenting or that chronic stress of a situation happening over and over and over again, it becomes very easy to believe these things about ourselves. And when we embrace learning about our past, looking at our past, not being afraid of it anymore. And that's a big thing for so many of the people that we work with or the people that are hesitant to even come in, honestly, is this fear of working through what happened to them. And I'm here to tell you that what happened to you is probably the scariest thing that's ever going to happen to you. And facing it is not nearly as scary. It can be scary in the moment. All of those feelings, all of the physical sensations do come back. I'm not going to deny that. That happens. But you survive it. And the more that you go through it and you relive it, there's this thing called exposure therapy, right? And part of the nice part about EMDR is it's kind of a form of exposure therapy. You're seeing that traumatic event replay, but you're seeing different pieces of it and you're seeing it in a different light. And it allows your brain to categorize it differently and not necessarily default to the same coping mechanisms. So we can then harness the power of our ability to overcome these things and find our internal strength and resilience. And looking at our past, right? It encourages us to view our adversity, our difficulties, our challenges in life as an opportunity for self-discovery and transformation. And for most of the people I know, most of the people I work with, the biggest struggle I would say that they have is that they don't trust themselves. They don't like themselves all the time. And a lot of their time is spent really worrying about everyone else and how to take care of everyone else and what everyone else is going to think. And part of that is that difficulty of really like knowing who we are. We don't feel secure in ourselves if we're constantly looking to others for validation, right? And doing that past work and learning about you and not being angry at yourself anymore, learning to forgive yourself and love yourself despite your flaws or whatever you have done in your life is truly meaningful work. That is how we learn, right? That's why history is important. They teach us history in school so we don't repeat the past mistakes. And then I talk to all these people and they're like, I don't need to go to therapy. Well, you should learn your own history and you should know your history and you should learn from what you've experienced in your life and grow from it instead of just repeating it and being like, that's the way that life is. No, that's the way that life was then. You know, life is very different from my grandma, like growing up when she grew up, raising kids when she raised kids, than it is for her now, right? Like she can't operate from that same worldview because it doesn't apply anymore. And that's kind of what looking at our past is. It's figuring out, does this apply now? You know, do I have the same life? Do I have the same challenges? Do I have the same obstacles? And do I have the same resources? Or do I have more? Do I have more opportunities or flexibility to fix the situation? And that is the hard part about trauma, right? Is especially that chronic stress. They say neurons that fire together wire together. And what that means is if we keep defaulting to these trauma responses over and over again, they're more likely to just automatically happen in our brain. Our brain is going to default to that answer because that neural connection is super strong. So what we want to train our brains to do is form new neural connections with healthier ways of coping that, you know, so it doesn't become so automatic and we don't stay trapped. Because it truly feels for so many people like they are just trapped in a life that is Murphy's Law, that is beyond their control, right? And it's not always true. I mean, I think it's very rarely true, honestly. I truly believe that we all have the power to change our lives. We all have the power and the internal strength to find meaning in life, to find purpose in life, to find enjoyment in life. And that doesn't mean that life doesn't get sad or anxiety producing or we don't get scared. It just means that we face it in a very different way. And we have the confidence in ourselves that no matter what happens, we can overcome. And for so many people walking around out there, that is not something that they can see today, that they feel like no matter what happens, they know that they can overcome it. I have some clients like that. They're my favorite clients. But those clients, you know, they have that ability because they've done a lot of work and they've looked at their adversity and they've seen what they've overcome, right? And they've, in that looking and in that growth of learning who they are, they really feel secure in the fact that, like, if all these things have happened to me and I survived, I'm just going to keep surviving, right? So that's what learning from our past should bring for us, right? We want to be able to learn from our past experiences to navigate life's challenges and evolve as individuals, not stay the same, right? Like, there are so many people that experience trauma and they are just depressed and feel hopeless and feel trapped. I especially when I was working in clinics, people with more severe mental health issues tend to have more severe trauma, guys. And they feel so trapped. And the beautiful thing about actually facing our past, about looking at it like deep and hard and like all encompassing, is it allows us to see that we did overcome. Like, we're still standing here. We might not feel great, right? You might not be living your best life quite yet, but you survived it. So now what are we going to do to get us to our best life, right? And by embracing our past and learning the lessons of our past, we can cultivate our own resilience. We can foster our own personal development and achieve the goals and the fulfillment that we're looking for in our lives. So that's my chat for today, guys. Just the importance of really getting to know you. Learning your past is your history. And to not repeat your history, we have to look at it. Otherwise, history is just going to repeat itself, and none of us want that. So you've been listening to Good Enough with Jamie Vollmoeller. You can follow our podcast anywhere you stream at Good Enough with the Trauma Therapist. I want to remind you guys that you are good enough.
Thank you for listening to Good Enough with the Trauma Therapist. We appreciate you listening. While our host may provide some personal and professional advice, we want to remind you that this show is for entertainment purposes only. Each individual situation is unique, and Good Enough is not a substitute for mental health treatment. If you need a therapist and are located in New York or Missouri, feel free to reach out to us at liendr.com or brave-mo.com.